We have a very interesting and unusual topic today to talk to Gary about, and that is the walkers of the late 1800s. Gary.
The sport was called pedestrianism in those days and became this really fascinating sport. In fact, it was our first real spectator sport in America. People came out in droves to watch these people walk around a track, and they gambled on it, and people won prizes. They even won a belt, like a boxing belt. Won these engraved silver belts that they were the champion walker.
Well, let's start at the beginning of the story. Is this something that really started in Watkins Glen?
Actually, no. It actually got started in Boston. There were two gentlemen, a guy by the name of Edward Weston, and he was a bookseller, and he made a bet with a friend of his named George Eddy about who would win the election of 1860. And Weston bet that Lincoln would not win, and of course he lost the bet. So the bet was that you had to walk from Boston to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. So Weston had to walk that distance, 478 miles. He had to walk in 10 days. He ended up getting there about 5 hours too late after the inauguration. But he got to actually meet Abraham Lincoln, who offered to pay his train fare home. But he said, no, I'll walk back. And what Weston found out was that along the way, crowds of people were showing up to see him. And he realized that, hey, I could make a living from this. So he started doing these competitive walking contests. He walked from Maine to Chicago and won, I think, a $10,000 prize. And then he started walking in competition against another gentleman named O'Leary. They had a walking contest in Chicago for a prize. And then everybody started doing it. So it became these big contests, and people would come out and they'd have food and drink for them as they watched these walkers, and they would bet on them, and they had bands playing music, and they went on for days. Sometimes they went on for as long as 6 days.
So how did it come into Watkins Glen?
Well, after the fad started catching on, there were walking matches in New York City and Chicago and London, England, and so everybody started having walking matches to compete. And so there was some in Elmira and some other localities. So then Watkins Glen decided they wanted to have a walking match as well. So one of the first ones was in the Freer Opera House, which is a building that still stands in Watkins Glen. It's where Jolando's Pizza is in Watkins now, that big stone building.
Yes.
The Opera House. On the upper floor, they walked around that track, and the winner in April of 1879 covered 243 miles, walking around and around and around in the upstairs of that building.
So these walking contests were typically done where somebody just walked around, they walked around and around in a circle, so
Right.
everybody could watch like laps in a race, for example.
Oh, yes,
They didn't go out of sight of the spectators?
Nope, they stayed in sight, yeah. And the second walking match in Watkins, which was even bigger, was on the site of the Watkins Sporting Goods store in Watkins Glen on 4th Street. But these guys drove themselves to the point of exhaustion. They would suddenly stop walking and maybe sleep for half an hour, then get up and start walking again. And people drove themselves to the point of just total exhaustion. And sometimes people were just staggering around like zombies. And there were some cases where people actually died from pushing themselves too far. And you have to wonder, what drove people to do this? Why were they doing this? And it seems that one of the answers is that it has to do with gender a little bit. Men after the Civil War felt like they were becoming soft. They didn't have a war to fight it anymore, and they're working in factories for wages. They don't really own their own business anymore, and they're dependent on these wages. And this was a way to exert their manliness again, is to go out and compete and show that they were strong men, and they could have this endurance to win these races.
Makes sense.
The walkers, while they're walking, often did things to stimulate themselves. They would be drinking out of bottles of champagne while they're walking. One guy was chewing on coca leaves, which they make cocaine from. So they did things like that to keep themselves going.
Interesting. And so do we have an idea of when this ended historically?
By the 1880s, it starts to fade. New York State starts passing laws. One first law said that women could no longer participate in pedestrianism. They couldn't do these walking matches anymore. Then they started restricting how long the walks could be. They said it couldn't be any longer than 6 days. They started limiting how many hours a day you could do it. So it kind of died out. And baseball began becoming more popular as a spectator sport by this time. And then also bicycle riding. became big as well. But even in 1902, you still had a walking match in the Opera House in Watkins Glen.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of contests where people used to have to keep their hand on a car in order to win the car.
Right, exactly,
Or
right. I thought of the same
dance-a-thons.
thing. Yeah, the dance
Those silly
marathons of the
things.
20s. Yeah,
Right.
people ruin their health doing those too. Yeah.
So Gary, this was a really interesting little tidbit about Watkins Glen and Schuyler County history. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Sure, it's fun to talk about.